The sun was hanging low over the dry plains when a dusty rider appeared on the horizon. The people of the small frontier town of Red River Crossing were used to strangers passing through, but this one had a different air about him. His name was Eli Dawson, a cowboy with quiet eyes and a tired soul. His horse, a brown mare with a white mark on her forehead, walked slowly, as if she had traveled many miles. Eli was not a man who talked much. He carried only a small saddlebag, a rifle strapped across his back, and a hat that shaded his face from the burning sun. Red River Crossing was not a fancy town. It was built from sun-baked wood, grit, and stubborn dreams. There were only a few buildings: a saloon, a small sheriff's office, a feed store, a stable, and the Red River Inn. The inn sat right in the center of town, run by a stern man named Henry Fletcher. His daughter, Clara May, was known by everyone in the area. Clara was strong, graceful, and quick with words when she needed to be. She helped her father keep the inn running, cooking, cleaning, welcoming guests, and managing the stubborn men who came through town. Clara had grown up surrounded by the sounds of boots on wooden floors, the smell of horses, and the rough talk of travelers. But she never lost her gentle heart. She had dreams bigger than the town itself. At night, she liked to sit by the window of her small room upstairs and imagine what lay beyond the plains. Places with wide rivers, bright cities, and people who didn't judge a woman by what she wore or said. But in Red River Crossing, things were simple and strict. People lived by rules written not on paper but in their minds and hearts. Reputation mattered more than gold, and a woman's honor was guarded like a treasure chest. When Eli Dawson arrived that evening, the air in town shifted a little. He was quiet, polite, and carried the kind of calm that made people curious. He tied his horse to the post outside the inn and stepped onto the creaky porch. Clara was sweeping the floor near the door. When she saw him, she noticed how his shoulders looked heavy, like a man who had walked through many storms without speaking of them. "Evening?" she said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "Evening," Eli replied softly, tipping his hat. He asked for a room. Clara nodded, gave him a small smile, and handed him the key to the room at the far end of the hall upstairs. That was her favorite room, the one with a small window overlooking the open land. She thought of how many people had come and gone through that room. Traders, travelers, dreamers. Eli looked like one of those people who never stayed too long anywhere. The night was warm and most of the townsfolk gathered at the saloon. Music from an old piano drifted through the streets. Clara finished her work late and carried a small basin of water up to the washroom at the back of the inn. This was her private time, when the guests were quiet and she could relax for a few minutes before sleeping. But fate is strange. It does not always knock before entering. Eli had stepped out of his room quietly, half asleep, looking for a water bucket. He had no idea Clara was in the washroom. The door, usually locked, had been left slightly open because the latch was loose, something Clara kept meaning to fix. As he pushed the door gently, it creaked. Clara turned around, startled. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Her face, his face, the sound of water dripping in the basin. Eli's eyes widened with shock. Clara let out a small gasp. He stepped back instantly, turning his head away and mumbling, "I'm so sorry." But in a town like Red River Crossing, even a moment like that could set a fire. The door had been open just long enough for Mrs. Cooper, the town gossip, to catch a glimpse as she passed through the hallway. She didn't see much, but she saw enough to start a story. By morning, that story had grown like a storm cloud. It rolled through the town faster than the wind. People whispered over their coffee, their shop counters, their stable doors. "Did you hear?" they said. The cowboy saw Clara May. She was, not proper. No one asked what really happened. In those times, it didn't matter. Truth was often drowned by the noise of what people wanted to believe. Henry Fletcher, Clara's father, was furious, not because he thought his daughter had done anything wrong, but because he knew how cruel the town could be. He stormed into the inn's front room where Eli was drinking a cup of black coffee. "You know what they're saying?" Henry's voice was low but full of thunder. "They're saying you ruined her name." Eli stood up slowly, calm but firm. "I don't care what you meant," Henry interrupted. "In this town, meaning don't matter. What they believe is what becomes the truth." Outside, a group of men had already gathered. The sheriff was among them. He wasn't a bad man, but he was a man of the town, and the town followed old laws. In those days, if a man was caught seeing a woman in a way that dishonored her name, There were only two choices: marry her or face punishment. It was meant to protect the woman, but in truth it often trapped both people in a situation neither of them had chosen. Clara came downstairs slowly. Her hair was tied back and her face was pale but steady. She had heard the whispers all morning. Some women had refused to meet her eyes. Others looked at her with quiet pity. But Clara was not someone who broke easily. She stood tall. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Miss Clara, Mr. Dawson, you both know the rules. This kind of matter can't be ignored." "I didn't do anything wrong," Clara said clearly, her voice cutting through the noise like a sharp wind. "I know," the sheriff replied gently, "but you know how it works here. Folks won't let it rest. If you two don't fix it the town's way, it won't end well." Eli clenched his fists at his sides. He hated being cornered. He had spent years riding away from rules, from bonds, from anything that tied him down. But now, without meaning to, he had stepped right into a storm. Henry's face was red with anger and fear. He loved his daughter. He didn't care about what the town thought of him, but he knew how cruel they could be to her. "They'll make life impossible for Clara if this isn't settled," he said through gritted teeth. The sheriff finally said the words everyone was waiting to hear. "Eli Dawson, you got until sunrise. You marry Clara May, or both of you will face judgment." Judgment. That word hung in the air like the weight of a stone. Everyone knew what it meant. The town would turn on them. It didn't need to be said out loud. Eli walked outside. The evening was quiet now. The sky was orange and purple. He stood by his horse and ran his hand through his hair. He had never planned on staying. He was just passing through. But now his name and Clara's name were tied together by something he didn't intend. He could leave, but if he did, it wouldn't just ruin her name. It would destroy her life in this small, unforgiving town. Clara stood by the window watching him. She wasn't crying. She had learned a long time ago that tears didn't fix anything. She thought about her life, about all the times she had been careful, polite, proper. And still, one moment had changed everything. As the sky darkened, the town prepared for what would happen at sunrise. Some whispered about a wedding. Others whispered about punishment. No one knew what Eli would choose, but one thing was clear. The cowboy and the innkeeper's daughter were standing at the edge of a moment that would shape their lives forever. And as the night grew still, Clara whispered to herself, "Sometimes, a person's story begins the moment they lose control of it." The night was quiet, but no one in Red River Crossing truly slept. Inside the inn, Clara sat near her window, staring at the moonlight falling on the dirt road. It was calm outside, but her heart was far from calm. She thought about everything that had happened in just a single day. One small moment, one unlucky accident, had turned her whole world upside down. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, even though the night was not cold. Her father had gone to his room hours ago, tired and worried. She had heard the way he spoke with the sheriff and the townspeople. There was no easy way out. Tomorrow morning at sunrise, everyone would gather in the town square. Eli would have to make a choice. She didn't know what to expect. She didn't even really know Eli Dawson. He was a stranger who had arrived only yesterday. But in a place like this, a stranger could become a part of your life without warning. Clara sighed softly. She wasn't someone who dreamed about weddings or dresses. She had always dreamed about freedom, to see the world, to make her own choices. But now everyone wanted to make this choice for her. Downstairs, Eli sat alone at one of the small tables in the empty dining room. A single lamp burned beside him, casting a warm golden glow on his face. His hat sat on the table, his hands folded in front of him. He looked like a man at war with his own thoughts. He had spent his life running from things that tied him down. Towns, people, promises. But tonight something was different. He didn't want to hurt Clara. He could see in her eyes that she was strong, but also that she didn't deserve this. None of this was her fault. And if he rode away before sunrise, it would be her who suffered most. Eli lifted his head when he heard soft footsteps. Clara had come down the stairs, her shawl still around her shoulders. She walked toward him slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "No, you?" "Not a wink," she said with a small, tired smile. She sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not cold. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people understand something without needing to say it. Finally, Clara spoke. "You don't have to do it, you know." Eli looked at her carefully. Do what? Marry me. Her voice was calm, not shaky. I know what everyone's saying, but this isn't your home. You don't owe anyone anything. He leaned back slightly in his chair. If I don't, what happens to you? She didn't answer at first. She didn't need to. They both knew. Life in Red River Crossing could be kind to the obedient and cruel to the different. Her name would be whispered with judgment for years. Doors would close in her face. People she had known since childhood would look at her like a stranger. She finally said, I'll survive. I always do. Eli looked down at his hands. It doesn't seem fair. Fair doesn't have much to do with this town, Clara replied softly. The lamp flickered slightly as a breeze slipped through the cracks in the window. Eli thought about the road ahead. He had always planned to ride toward the west where the land opened wide and no one asked questions. But now he felt something heavy in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was responsibility. It was the quiet knowledge that walking away would leave a scar, not just on Clara but on himself. You don't know me, Eli said after a long silence. You don't know the kind of life I've lived. Clara gave a small laugh, but it wasn't a mocking one. I don't need to know everything. I just need to know if you're a good man. Am I? He asked. She met his eyes steadily. I think so. For the first time, Eli didn't feel like a stranger in this town. The way Clara spoke to him without fear or bitterness made him feel seen, not as the cowboy passing through, but as a man standing at a crossroad. The night stretched on. They talked quietly, not about the town or the problem waiting for them at sunrise, but about little things, about the stars, about how she used to ride a pony when she was young, about how he once tried to build a house out of old wood, but it fell apart in the rain. By the time they fell silent again, something soft had formed between them. Not love, not yet, but something like trust. Outside, a rooster crowed faintly. The sky was beginning to turn pale at the edges. The time for choice was near. When the first rays of sunlight touched the roofs of Red River Crossing, the townspeople were already gathering in the square. Weddings in this town were usually joyful affairs, full of music, food, and laughter. But today the air was heavy. People whispered to each other, curious about what the cowboy would decide. The sheriff stood near the small wooden stage, his hat pulled low. Henry Fletcher stood beside him, his jaw tight. Clara's best friend Annie stood in the crowd, clutching her hands nervously. Even Mrs. Cooper, the woman whose sharp eyes had started it all, stood at the front, pretending to be innocent. The inn door opened slowly. Clara stepped out first. She wore a plain but clean white dress. Her hair was tied back neatly. She held her head high. She would not show fear, not today. She walked toward the square with quiet strength, each step echoing in the still morning air. Eli followed behind her. He wore his same dusty shirt, but he had straightened his collar and brushed his hat. He looked like a man who had made peace with a storm. The sheriff stepped forward. Eli Dawson, Clara May Fletcher. This town is waiting for your decision. Eli looked at Clara. She didn't beg him with her eyes. She didn't ask for help. She simply stood beside him, as proud as a mountain in the wind. Eli took a deep breath. For a moment, time felt slow. He thought about the long road behind him, about the places he'd been, about all the times he chose to leave instead of stay. And then he thought about this town, about the girl who had stood strong even as everyone whispered her name. He stepped forward and said clearly, "Then let them hear it. She's my wife now." The crowd broke into murmurs. Some were surprised, some were pleased, some simply nodded as if this was the only ending they had expected. The sheriff nodded slowly and began the simple ceremony. As the sun rose higher, Eli and Clara stood side by side, repeating the few quiet words that tied their names together in the eyes of the town. When it was over, people clapped softly. There was no music, no dancing, but there was something else in the air, something that felt like a shift. Clara's father put a hand on her shoulder. His eyes were a little wet, but he smiled, a proud and quiet smile. "You're stronger than they'll ever know," he whispered to her. Annie hugged Clara tightly. "I knew he'd do the right thing," she said, grinning. Eli stood a little to the side, looking out at the wide land beyond the town. He could still ride away, he thought. He could still disappear, but for some reason the idea didn't feel the same anymore. Later that day, Clara and Eli sat on the back porch of the inn. The sun was warm, the wind was soft, and the town was slowly returning to its usual rhythm. She sipped a cup of tea. He leaned back against the wall. "Why did you say yes?" she asked finally, turning to him. Eli took off his hat and set it on his knee. "Because walking away wouldn't have been the right thing. And maybe," he said with a small, almost shy smile, "maybe I'm tired of walking away." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled too. Not a big smile, but a small one that felt real. They both knew their lives would not suddenly become a fairy tale. It wouldn't be easy. There would be whispers, there would be challenges. But they also knew something else. They were no longer standing alone. Days turned into weeks. Slowly the whispers died down. Eli began helping around the inn. He fixed the loose porch steps, mended the fences, and even helped Henry repair an old wagon. People in town who once looked at him with curiosity or suspicion started greeting him with nods. Clara found herself talking to him more than she had ever expected. They learned about each other's past, not everything at once, but piece by piece, like fitting together parts of a puzzle. She learned that he had once dreamed of owning a small piece of land. He learned that she wanted to see the world. One evening, they stood on that same porch looking at the sunset. The light painted the sky in soft gold and rose. Clara turned to him and said, "You know, one day I still want to travel." Eli smiled gently. "Then maybe one day I'll ride with you." She laughed softly. It wasn't a promise set in stone, but it was enough. It was hope. And sometimes, in a world as hard as theirs, hope was more powerful than anything else. That night, as the stars came out, Eli sat on the porch long after Clara had gone to bed. He looked at the sky and thought about how strange life could be. He had arrived in this town planning to leave before anyone remembered his name. Instead, he had stayed. And Clara, who once dreamed of leaving everything behind, had found a reason to stand a little taller, to smile a little brighter. They hadn't chosen this beginning, but maybe, just maybe, they could choose everything that came after. The wind moved gently through the town, as if whispering that sometimes unexpected moments can change everything, not with grand gestures or loud declarations, but with quiet choices that speak louder than words.